Okay. Good morning. Today is Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. We're resuming our work on S311, and we have with us next up Christopher Roy. So Mr. Roy, good morning. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning.
Introduce yourself for the record and talk to us about
Something, okay.
housing. You heard the discussion so far. Thanks for coming in and spending time.
So yes, thank you. My name is Chris Roy, and I'm the chair of the Down Martin. Let me get this right. Complex Land Use Development Group. And it's a group of permit lawyers, real estate lawyers, utility lawyers, corporate lawyers who work on complex projects because complex projects involve all kinds of work. The piece that I typically work on has to do with permitting and permit appeals. And as I mentioned before the break, I'm working with Zach Hale and Dusevich Inc. on their proposed senior living project in Castleton. So that's the sort of project that I typically work on now. But my interest in land use and Act 250 goes much further back. I grew up down the road in Barry. My dad grew up in Barry. My mom grew up on a dairy farm in Derby. Left the state to go to school, came back here and been with Down Franklin since, but over that time became increasingly interested in and involved in land use questions. In the early 90s, I was on the Burlington Planning Commission. Then after that, I was appointed by Governor Douglas to serve on the old Vermont Environmental Board back when it heard Act 250 appeals. I don't take it personally, but as soon as I was appointed, immediately the General Assembly started looking at getting the appeals away from the Environmental Board. So I remind myself that correlation is not causation, but it wasn't my fault. I also have dealt with housing and land use issues as a member of the Williston Select Board. And then I represented Williston on the Regional Planning Commission and was chair of the Regional Planning Commission for a couple of years. So this is an issue, outside of, what I do for my legal clients has been of interest to me for a while. And Act 250 has been of interest to me. Now, we could talk about this, and you guys have talked about this for days upon days upon days over the last several years. I mean, there's a lot of complexity. If it was an easy question, you would have come up with the obvious solution years ago. And I'm not going to try in my short period of time to solve all the problems. One fundamental economic concept, though, is if you are having a housing crisis and a crisis of affordability in housing, what you have to do is figure out a way to responsibly increase the stock of housing, the supply of housing. And that means housing across the spectrum. That means affordable housing, like Zach was talking about earlier, like the missing middle. I grew up in a 3-bedroom ranch in Barry Town, and I can remember when I was on the select board asking our public works guy, why is it you don't see neighborhoods like that anymore? And he explained, well, back then, the town would put the road in, the utility would put the utilities in, and the builder only had to put up the sticks. And so there wasn't as much cost. It was built in, and over time, that model has changed. And so they started to, get me thinking about both the economics of housing as opposed to just sort of the land use aspects of it. There's been a lot of discussion about the desire to avoid Act 250 and why. I think it's not disputed that people do avoid Act 250. Why and whether it's for good reasons is open to debate, but there's no doubt that people do avoid Act 250. And given my years practicing in the area, the two primary reasons for that have to do with the delay that it brings and the duplication of reviews. That in a lot of communities, well, when Act 250 was passed, there wasn't a Clean Air Act, there wasn't a Clean Water Act. Most towns didn't have zoning, ANR didn't have rigorous permitting. And all of a sudden, they were slapping condos up on the hill and the sewage was running down the slope. And Act 250 stepped in to fill that sort of regulatory divot. The world now is very different. Towns have anything from extraordinarily comprehensive zoning to good zoning, but they pretty much all have it except very small towns. The state regulates many aspects. The feds regulate many aspects. So there is now a duplication of review, and duplication involves more consultants, more cost, more time. What I would like to focus a little bit on is the question of delay and process. Jurisdictional thresholds and all those things are extraordinarily important. But again, we could spend days talking about that, and you've heard from other people about those things. One of the big issues that's been talked about, and I've spoken to a number of committees about this over the years, is the question of whether the environmental board, as it used to be, should be disinterred and start hearing Act 250 appeals again. And I come at that issue as somebody who served on the environmental board, enjoy the people I worked with who cover the entire political spectrum that you could imagine. I thought we did excellent work. We were earnest. I still cite to many of those decisions today. Occasionally, it's ones that I dissented on, but they were still good decisions. But I still think that it would be a bad idea to disinter the environmental board. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the quality of the work or the merit of their efforts or their intentions. It has to do with a couple key unavoidable consequences of that. First of all, the environmental board, natural resources board, whatever you want to call it, primary responsibility is to administer the statewide Act 250 program. And that means managing the district coordinators and district commissions, conducting rulemaking, coming before you when Act 250 matters are on your docket, and really doing a job of managing and administering Act 250. From my perspective, ideally, if a difficult jurisdictional issue comes up before a district coordinator, that district coordinator should be able to make use of the resources of the NRB, legal and otherwise, to tackle that issue. If you
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Make use, does that mean consult with, refer up, or both?
I would say consult with, because if the difficulty with having the NRB or the ERB or whatever, we'll just call it the board, no, I don't have to worry about that. Having the board hear appeals is it really ties their hands in being able to provide support at the first level.
Because you're appealing to the same entity who wrote the rule.
The Supreme Court justices don't go down and help the trial judge write the decision and then sit there and be a neutral decision maker on appeal. And so if you have a board that is actively managing and administering the program, they should be providing support and input. And I think they can't do that if they're then asked to be a neutral arbitrator, because either they will have to give up that level of support in order to maintain their neutrality, or they won't give up that level of support. And then it'll be very easy for people who don't do well in the process to look at that as a process that wasn't fair.
When you were on the e-board, were you hearing appeals?
Yes.
Yeah. And so what was the process? Did that mean that you had, I don't know if it's a firewall?
Yeah.
You didn't consult down to the DC level.
Correct.
You stayed separate.
So John Hazen was general counsel when I was there, and he was very diligent about it. Is if he would not advise about any specific case. If there was a general procedural issue, divorce from a particular case, he would help them. But he couldn't provide advice. So these are complicated issues sometimes. And you have district coordinators and district commissions with different backgrounds, different levels of experience. And if they don't have this experience support from the central board, I think that undermines their ability to do that,
Sure.
to do that mission.
Right, is that also, I mean, it seems like it might feed into the whole thing of, you don't necessarily get the same answer from each commission.
Right.
Which,
Now, one change that could be done that might help with this would be to have jurisdictional opinions heard by the board instead of district coordinators. I think that would address consistency, and it would also put the request at the place where there are the people administering the program that know the broader permutations across the state and might be able to give that perspective to it, as opposed to the district coordinators.
if they were to hear those JOs, is that workable? Because it sounds like you're saying this board, whatever it's called, should be able to consult back down to the DC level.
Yeah.
And support their work. So how do we know that the JO part of it, it's sort of firewalled off enough that it's okay that.
Well, I mean, what I'm talking about is you don't file JOs with district coordinators. Then it goes straight to, and then, so instead of just, right now it's district coordinator, environmental court.
Yeah.
You could either go board, court, Supreme Court, or even board straight to the Supreme Court if you wanted to. But that would allow, at least on the jurisdictional side, to have the board looking at those issues, because those are separate from evaluating a project under the various criteria, which would be the substantive work that the district commission would do. The other sort of practical issue, and I know that this is one of the primary concerns that led legislators to go through permit reform 20 years ago, is zoning standards and Act 250 standards are different, but they frequently cover a lot of the same things. And one example would be if you get conditional use approval in town, it can have an adverse impact on the character of the area. And in Act 250, you have to go through the Queasy test, which looks at context and adverse impact and the like. And the way the Supreme Court looks at those decisions is they're essentially judgment calls based upon the evidence presented. And so long as there's evidence supporting the outcome, the Supreme Court will defer to that determination. So if you have a contested project, and presumably each side is presenting their evidence as to why it will have an adverse impact or won't have an adverse impact, you would go to the board and the court, and the same evidence would be presented. And the board could say yes, the court could say no. Both would go up to an appeal, and both decisions would be affirmed because there were facts in the record supporting each outcome. It was a 60-40 question, but you lose on appeal if 40% of the evidence supported what the judge concluded. So it essentially creates two bites at the apple, because by its nature, an applicant has to satisfy all permits in order to build. So you would have the same issue. They would have to win between two different decision makers in order to proceed. And an appeal to the Supreme Court would not reconcile the differences of opinion, because presumably there'd be support for each.
So the two, this bifurcated appeal thing that you're talking about, court and the board, is this because the same project could have the municipal decision would be going to environmental court? An appeal of the Act 250 piece will be going up to the board. So now you have those two to reconcile it.
Right, and then A&R and other state permits would also be going to the environmental court.
So this is an argument for sticking with sending everything to
Environmental court. Another sort of more near-term reason I think the council's against having the board take appeals at this time is given the entirety of S311 and H687 and the tiers and the mapping, the rulemaking, the new composition of the board, that is a lot to be putting on that board's plate. And and that's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be extremely important work. It's going to take time, resources, energy, ability to ask that same group of people, oh, and oh, by the way, start hearing appeals too. And you don't have procedural rules for appeals, so why don't you promulgate some procedural rules? I think it is setting the reforms that get, in whatever form that get enacted this session, setting them up for failure because it's just too much of an ask. And I think it might make sense to take the question of the appeal going to the board, and if not throwing it up, then put it in the parking lot and say, let's get through this stuff. And then we can see how that's working. And then as its own piece, now let's see if, given how the new board is working, how the reforms are working, now let's look at whether it makes sense to do a separate appeal to the board. I would still likely oppose that for the other reasons that I've stated, but even if you're, I mean, presumably any reform that you pass, you want to succeed. And I just am afraid that it's too big of an ask to also throw appeals in at the same time. They're going to be doing that.
So when you were on the e-board, that your decisions were precedential, right, for
Yeah.
future cases. Who in your view of what's coming ought to be setting that precedent? Would it be? Because otherwise, it seems like it's happening commission by commission. Who's going to reconcile?
Yeah, and well, that would be the benefit of JOs going through the NRB, because I do think that would then become precedent. District coordinator decisions, I mean, sometimes you'll find one and you try to use it within that district, but it's not, it's persuasive precedent, it's not binding precedent. And by, you know, when permit reform was passed in the 2000s, it was, part of that was that the prior decisions of the environmental board were given the same precedential effect of environmental, and to this day, you know, I'll have cases where I'm citing to both prior environmental board decisions and current environmental court decisions, and together, and the environmental court absolutely does look to what the board did before.
Quick question on district coordinators. Is there a little bit aside from the appeal, but you have experience, we've heard concerns about inconsistency and of work, and then also an inability for the board to require change, you know, manage that work. Is that?
There's and in a little bit, I don't want to give it short swift. There is an issue about district coordinators are sort of gatekeepers. And a district, as a practical matter, a district coordinator can make life very miserable for somebody or very easy for somebody. And the way I think that you address that can be twofold. One, going back to sort of that active management model, where if you have a real robust administration of Act 250, you have a more active management and oversight and training by the board. And the other is to build into the system more firm deadlines that gives them less leeway to either move things through quickly or slowly, depending upon how they view the project. Before I get off of the appellate piece, though, the one thing I do want to mention, I know that the analogy has been made a few times about the Public Utility Commission, and that's sort of a professional board model and one which people have looked to as an example. And I think it's not really analogous for a couple of reasons. One, the PUC has an entire dedicated department, the DPS, that is doing a lot of substantive work in the area and is a regular participant and has set up a whole process and a whole level of work and review that doesn't exist in Act 250. Instead, what you have in Act 250 is all the district commissions and district coordinators. So it's a very different scenario. If you didn't go through the district commission at all, then you could do something like the PUC. You say, okay, Act 250 decisions are made by the central board. We're gonna have this Department of Natural Resources permitting, and they're gonna work hand in glove with that, and you're gonna do it there. So it's, I think, because of the differences in the structure, that the PUC analogy isn't as helpful as it might be.
Well, and it was something I said sort of on the fly, like, okay, so without having really thought through how analogous it was or wasn't, but thanks for
Yeah.
that.
But I think, sort of the number of people on it and their backgrounds and whether, I mean, I do think, and I was speaking to Representative Sheldon's committee with some other practicing lawyers. And one thing that we all agreed on was that more robust funding and staffing for the board would be a good thing. Because there are times when, I think they're under-resourced and there's a bit of running around with their hair on fire because they're having to deal with so many things. And it's that, compared to back when I was on the board, it's, a third of the people, and I'm sure the budget's a fraction of what it was. So, that, I think, having that, and then sort of, we used to do a lot more internal training than I think they do now, and really having standardized training, not only for the coordinators, but also for commissioners. You have some district commissioners who have been on the district commission for 15, 20 years, and they know as much or more about Act 250 than I ever will. And then you have new people, right? And when you're new, you're learning, and you defer to staff and you defer to others, and I think there needs to be some more robust training so that they have sort of that base of knowledge. But to address the question of sort of the unpredictability delay piece and how you would deal with it within the process. So this isn't the question of whether projects should be exempt or not exempt. It's a question of, if you're in the permit process, what are ways that it can be made to be more efficient, predictable, because at the end of the day, the applicant, I work not exclusively, but predominantly with applicants. And I haven't, maybe they just know not to come to me, but I've never worked with an applicant that comes to me and says, all right, tell me how to screw Act 250. What they have is a lot of spreadsheets, like Zach, and they're trying to figure out, what can I build on this property? What's the time frame? What are the contingencies? And then they run their numbers and they see if it pencils out, to use Zach's term. Which of course nobody uses pencils anymore, but that's okay. Well, there's probably a couple. There's probably a couple of my.
Wait,
I know.
you're in the lot of.
Well, that's fine. I did bring a laptop up here. And then I gotta put my glasses on to see it. And the difficulty is, if I have a client say, okay, I got this project. I've talked with the neighbors, everybody else, and it looks like we're gonna have some support, but there's a couple people who might not like it. It's like, how long is it gonna take? You can usually guess with the DRB process what it's gonna take. And part of it is that there's a deadline that they have 40 days after the end of the DRB hearing to issue a decision. So that sort of puts an endpoint on it. Now there's the possibility of appeal, and then you talk to them about that. But then you go with Act 250, and how long is that gonna take? And if there's an appeal, how long is that gonna take? And that is much more difficult to estimate. If a project has no opposition, or even no, it's a fairly non-controversial one, it goes through pretty well. The problem is, I can't guarantee to a client that that's the way it's gonna go, because it quite literally takes one person. I represented the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. having to do with an expansion that was needed on their campus. It was an infill, it was a new ward within their campus. And there was one neighbor across the street. And she did it without a lawyer, which meant the court had to bend over backwards and walk her through the process. And we ended up having to deal with her for about 1.5 years before the project was able to move forward. And it was a desperately needed project for the hospital and the community. I had a grocery store project that was proposed in a commercial park in a village center. And after 6 years and $1 million in legal and consulting fees, having never lost on any major issue, they walked away and said, it's not worth it anymore. We'll go build in New York. And so the grocery store, I mean, it was good. I mean, to some extent, me talking about efficiency is against my business interests. I mean, lawyers do great with an inefficient process. And if you all decide to have a second appeal to a board, I mean, my partners would probably be happy to hear about that. But taking off that hat and putting on my other hat, I'm like, I don't know that, I think efficiency and predictability is what we should be shooting for. And the way you do that, there right now in Act 250, there are certain steps that just are creating opportunities for delay where it's not really necessary. First of all, you file your application. Then you need the coordinator to say your application is complete. And some coordinators and some projects will treat that as, have you convinced me your project should get a permit? So they will keep asking for more stuff until they decide, okay, now I'll send it along to the district commission. Well, that's not what that's supposed to be. You're supposed to have just like the basic stuff that's a complete application so that you then schedule a hearing and you start to proceed. And so you can't, and there's a timeline from when it's deemed complete to when they have to have a pre-hearing conference or a hearing. So what they do is they just don't deem it complete. And so putting some, I'm not saying you have to accept every application that comes in, but, do one thing that says this is what you have to submit and get it out within X days and have the response within X days would sort of put a bracket on that process.
Sure. So just to make sure I'm following, it's the district coordinator who's that gatekeeper.
Correct.
The determination of complete. And you've seen sort of a rolling set of requests. It's not like one time around, is it? And I can imagine that being sort of abusive or stringing someone along, or it could be that when they bring piece of information number 2, it precipitates another question and you say, oh, I need another piece of information so I can finish the evaluation.
But they're not, you should be evaluating, really, I mean, ultimately, it's the district commission at the hearing that decides, and you are able to present things at the hearing that weren't in your application. I mean, that's why you have a hearing, otherwise you just look at the application. So I think that having a single, if additional materials are needed, you can make a single request listing them, and it has to be within a certain number of days. That would be good, because then that would trigger the pre-hearing conference or the hearings, usually a pre-hearing conference. Now, with both, now you have the pre-hearing conference. Then there is inevitably what's called a pre-hearing conference recess order. And that's, okay, before trial, before the hearing, these are some additional things we want. And that's now the district commission is providing input. We really, before we go to hearing, we also want to see, and sometimes it's other permits, sometimes it's some supplemental analysis. Again, there, on occasion, multiple pre-hearing conference recess orders. So it just becomes number 2, number 3, and then everyone gets to respond to every submission. So you're getting out. So I think, again, 1 pre-hearing conference recess order. And then after the hearing, 1 hearing recess order, and then a decision. And what that would do, you'd still have the same level of review that you're having now. It would just make much more predictable the time frame, and more importantly, I think. I think everyone's in agreement that if a project is good and meets all the necessary standards, it shouldn't fail because of delay. I had a redevelopment of an old ski area, and it was 3 years from application to getting before the environmental court. And eventually, after the whole process was done, my client got the permit. And in the meantime, he applied just before COVID, and to recently, when he got through the process, all of the construction costs, everything were through the roof, and the project no longer, the phrase again, penciled out. And so he can't build it right now, and he's scrambling, so he has a fully, so when you get your Act 250 statistics, they'll say, well, this permit was granted. Well, it was granted after 4 years, and the delay meant that it can't proceed. I think everyone doesn't want projects to fail for delay. If they fail on the merits, that's life in the big city. But failing for delay purposes, I think nobody wants. And in environmental court, again, I think those procedures can be tightened up. You can eliminate discovery. You can create deadlines for how quickly a decision has to issue and so on. But the last point I want to make about, and this goes to sort of the fundamental issue of why Act 250 process is something that people avoid, and I think for reasonable reasons. And this applies to some of my clients, not all of them. And it applies to regulations other than Act 250.
Yes.
Big business does just fine with big government. This is going back to my days as a political science major. So if you have big government with lots of regulation, lots of barriers of entry, requires lots of people doing lots of stuff, big businesses can absorb that. They can set up the infrastructure. They have the resources to do that. And the barriers of entry for guys like Zach, the big guys, it's like, okay, and yeah, prices are up, but as soon as I build that house, it gets bought, and I'll build a lot of big houses and they'll get bought immediately. It's the small and the middle size developers who are trying to do projects like Zach does. And you've heard him say this, the Castleton project, he is a consultant with Dusevich. Dusevich is the actual developer. Zach, given his expertise, is working on some of the funding and other community issues. It's them that look at that as like, I don't have the resources to spend all of the money on that engineering and other analysis without knowing how long it's going to take and what the chances are, and I'm just not going to do it. And as a consequence, you're not getting nearly as many of those small and medium-sized projects that are really in an aggregate are going to be the gap fillers that are going to address the housing issue. I don't think we're going to build our way out of housing by a lot of these subdivisions. I mean, I just don't, that's not going to happen. You've got existing housing stock, like Zach was talking about, when people move into a senior facility, now the house that they were in is available, and that's the sort of the rolling stock that you want to have refurbished, rehabbed, maybe expanded, and the barriers of entry created by an extra layer of regulation is what inhibits a lot of the real estate development. The big guys will survive and build big projects one way or the other. I think it's the small and medium guys.
Have you noticed since S100 passed, so the limit went up to 24 units from and PH, we took the cap off entirely with those centers. Have you seen the market responding to that?
I unfortunately, of course, that happened right about the time interest rates went up. So I think the benefits of that have been suppressed by the market. But I have And one aspect of that, I think that really has made it different for planning purposes is parking. How much parking is required? That's a big piece too, because if you have finite space and you have to have 2 spaces for every unit, you're just, and now you get all of the stormwater implications of that, the space implications. So I do think that was definitely, I think we haven't seen as much benefit from it because of the unfavorable interest rate right now. I think you'll see it more, and you'll see things like the upzoning that Burlington just did. And you're gonna see other communities are gonna follow suit. I think you'll start to see that more.
So you mentioned house energy, environment and energy, so. We're gonna be taking up 687 Thursday. Have they heard all the things you've shared with us?
Yes, I did. I spoke to Representative Sullivan's committee earlier this session. Predominantly about this. I don't think I mentioned the PUC because I'm already started. And I also spoken to the rural caucus and also to the Senate Economic Development Committee. So
Great, then, well, thank you for pitching in, making trips to my.
Thank you. Some of the suggestions that you had around the activity process. And I'm still new to the details of what happens in that application process. So forgive me if I get some of this wrong, but is that process of like, first you need to have your application deemed complete, and then you might have some pre-hearing conferences, and then you might have the hearing. Is that process laid out in statute or in rule?
Some of it is in statute, some of it is in rule.
Okay.
Some of the deadlines are included in the current version of Act 250, and then there are also Act 250 rules that deal with applications and hearings and whether to have a pre-hearing, whether it's going to be a minor or a major, and those things.
So as a follow-up to that, for the couple of suggestions that you had around, if you need more materials, you can ask, you have one request and it's gotta be within a certain number of days, or with the, potential for just having one pre-hearing conference meeting or whatever. Do you have language?
I have, and I'd be happy to. I had put together a summary of some like specific deadline things that I'd be happy to submit. And I could also just put together a bullet of the various points that I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, even just in terms of like streamlining the process, so to make it more predictable, I think what you were saying about, the DRB process is predictable. There may be appeals, but you can sort of wrap your arms around it, right? But with Act 250, it's less predictable and you can't really say, I mean, it is baffling to me that a project could take 6 years in court like that. We probably have other witnesses, we probably have to go on, but at some point I would love to hear like. I mean, I've heard other stories of that, where different projects have taken like a decade to go through the process. Like, how does that happen? Like, I don't understand.
What I can offer you if you want with my submission, I have 3 different projects in mind that I could do sort of, and I won't name the project, but I can give you the essentials and sort of give you the various things when they happened and what it took. One was a grocery store, one was a rehab of a ski area, and one is a residential subdivision that's going through the process now. I could sort of just give you an idea of all of the steps that they went through, so you have that.
Just to follow up on your question, so it seemed as though we've seen Act 250 stuff become involved with appeals getting bogged down. Have you seen the same thing happen though to municipal? Like,
Well, I think the environmental court process could also be streamlined. I think that there's not enough, again, like a lot of our processes in Vermont, they're sort of set up with the idea that everybody is in a Norman Rockwell painting and acting earnestly in public. And 95% of the people probably are, but the 5% who aren't know how to use process for process's sake to try to grind a project down until people give up. And that's basically, it's a war of attrition. So again, in the memo that I prepared before also includes some environmental thoughts as to ways that could be made more efficient and more predictable as far as how long that would take. So I'll make sure to include that too.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We could, I think, talk to you for a long time. We do have two more witnesses, so. Chairman McCormick, last question on you, and hold on.
I've expressed my general opposition to exemptions. And I remain cautious about that. Because one of my problems with exemptions is that the argument for exemptions ignores the benefits of therapy. It is as though all Act 250 is a betterment to good stuff you want. And I think that's the problem. However, and I've said this all along, ways to make the actual process faster, more predictable, I think is the desire. People have a right to finality. As an analogy, I, as a father, swore I would never use the phrase "because I'm your father" and I said so. I did. Eventually, because my democratic fathership wasn't working. We've been arguing for 2 hours. And I was the father. So, and so I would welcome suggestions on how to make the process go.
Because I do think you're
very
right.
more
There's two, because if you eliminate the incentives in favor of delaying projects, then that eliminates that whole force that undermines the permit process. I think another area is duplication. Originally, you didn't have all the A&R permits you do now. So, there's a question, do you need stormwater and wetlands and all that stuff in Act 250 if A&R is also covering it? And so if you focus Act 250 on the parts that it uniquely deals with, and you make the process efficient and predictable, then the aversion to Act 250 diminishes significantly. So there's two approaches, the sort of exemption approach, and I think, that, and I'll spill my finger and figure that out. And then there's, if you're in the process, how do you make it more efficient?
One other comment about the objectivity of the state board on hearing appeals. If they have, my information is like over 30 years old, and this is dated, but when I chaired a district commission, I was on the phone to Montpelier all the time, but I never spoke to someone from the board. I spoke to the coordinator for legal advice.
Right, well, you either would speak to your coordinator, and it's usually then the coordinator that would get in touch with the environmental board. Commissioners wouldn't do it directly because now you're a commissioner, you're a hearing officer.
Well, no, I'm procedural things. When I was chairing, it's quasi judicial, which is tricky.
Yes.
And I was in the role of basically pretending to be a judge.
Right.
And so I would call when someone would, and there were lawyers who very cleverly understood that I really wanted to do this right. And so they would raise procedural, and I was punching over my weight, so I called them.
Yep. No, and when I was on the board, we really were pushing to figure out a way to provide more support, because we did trainings. In fact, a couple of years, I was the one that would look at the prior year's precedent, go over it with people, just generally, what does this mean? How does this apply? I think they've gotten away from that, probably due to resources and staffing. And I think that is huge because it just empowers people like you, who are, the $25 stipend you get a day or whatever, if you're lucky.
35.
Oh, 35. It gives them, they deserve support because they're giving of their time and energy.
So, thank you so much
Yes.
again. We'll look forward to your memo. If I could add one thing to it, and that would be if you could, maybe speak a little bit to the degree to which A and R permits should create a rebuttable presumption of active governance.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very
Thank you
much.
for your time, appreciate it.
With that, I'd like to invite, Mr. Is it Deso?
Decent.
Deso.
Hi.
Deso. Good morning.
Thank you for your time this morning.
Yeah, thanks for joining us all morning. Thanks. If you could just introduce yourself for the record, then.
Absolutely. My name is Brendan Deso. I own and operate a manufactured housing retailership called B&H Housing. We're right in the middle of the Swanton Highgate line, right by exit 21. I have a mini storage facility on my site. With roughly 300 units. It's actively expanding, and I own a small real estate brokerage and a licensed broker. So I work with folks every day that are on all spectrums of this housing crisis, and I know that it probably feels very repetitive to hear crisis used over and over again, and it's almost becoming too common of a word, but it's real. I work with folks both in my mini storage operation and my manufactured housing retailership that are affluent and who are moderate to low income. I work with folks that are maybe listing their $800,000 home on the lake and need a couple storage units to stage their home and then keep them while their new home on the hills being built. I also work with people that have recently been evicted and are between housing and can't find a place that's affordable for them and their families to live. They're couch surfing. It's a real crisis and it's beyond affordability. That's a huge aspect of it that's affecting everybody. The rental market increases year over year, if not every 6 months. And it's folks that just don't have access to housing, period. Maybe they're not in the strongest pool of applicants, among the strongest of a pool of applicants. And maybe 2 years ago, they would have been able to eke through an application and get a unit. But now the upper echelon of folks applying to rent apartments seems to have grown to a point where folks on the bottom end that don't have an 800 credit score and don't make 6 figures aren't able to compete for those same rental opportunities that would have otherwise been available to them. So my specialty as a manufactured housing retailer traditionally has been to buy 5 to 15 acre parcels, maybe 20 acres, and do small scale residential subdivisions. So I'm here to speak to why I actively go about avoiding Act 250 and when I make the decision that Act 250 is working. And there are 2 things that I do in determining that. It's a cost benefit analysis on is the extra consulting, engineering, permit fees, is it worth it from a perspective of profitability? And does it increase that initial investment needed to start a project with soft costs, land costs? Does it increase it by a percentage where the risk of not having the permit go through after expending all that capital to get those permits? Is it too much of a risk if the project fails and never gets built and I'm unable to recoup those funds? So I've got 3 different examples of projects that I've been actively involved in the last 5 years to share with you. I could sit here with you all for 6 hours and go through properties I've identified, try to do analysis on, had to walk away from for one reason or another, but I picked 3 that I think illustrate a lot of key points that will be beneficial to you all as you consider 311 and H 687, the House 950 bill. I had a 16-acre sand pit that needed to be reclaimed in Highgate. The soils on the property, the native soils, weren't good enough for agriculture. They were deemed non-prime ag. But they supported high density for on-site septic. And we were able to site plan the property we probably could have done somewhere between 22 and 25 housing units. And when I do this, I'm not building a mobile home community, a trailer park. I'm subdividing the lot, I'm placing the home, I'm selling it to somebody as a turnkey package, usually financed by a federally backed loan, whether it be FHA, VA, RD. And in a lot of cases, people are able to even roll in their closing costs. So I've got folks that are stuck in, renting. They don't have an access. The market is not available to them on the lower end to access attainable housing. So they come to me, and I've had clients leave a closing table with a check from their finance institution and go spend that on furniture to put in their new home. I mean, this is a low barrier, entry form of housing. The last few years, we've seen, you know, prices go through the roof, and I've switched focus, which I'll illuminate to later, but, so I had that 16-acre parcel. Without municipal water and sewer, I could have subdivided 20 to 25 lots, let's say. I ran into a barrier at the municipal level, 1 acre lot size minimum per dwelling. And this was not in an area that was off a dirt road at the top of the hill. This was in an area that was already heavily developed for residential purposes. With lots under an acre in a lot of cases. So I was, you know, whatever, we'll do 16. So I did the cost benefit analysis and the risk reward analysis on an Act 250 permit, and decided I'm gonna go through all 16, I'm gonna trigger Act 250, we'll get through it. Act 250 in and of itself is not a be all end all to a project, but when you're a small or medium sized developer like I am, the margin of what's worth it and what's not gets really tight when you're between 10 and 15. You know, you really need to get to 15 to 20 to get it to the point where it's worth that extra risk and that time and the capital outlay. So I went to the DRB. I had an abutting property owner that happened to be the chair of the select board at the time in that municipality. He looked out his window every day in the morning and saw an open parcel and didn't want 16 new manufactured homes with the associated pets and children and whatnot. And he attended every DRB hearing that I had. And I wish they would have either denied or granted me a permit immediately so I could go to environmental court and meter it out. The way that I was treated in that particular case was I get sent from a preliminary plat review to final. A perceived issue, oftentimes that lived outside of the purview of the development review board and their specific succinct set of bylaws, would be brought forward by a member of the public. And I'd be sent back to preliminary, and then I get moved to final, and then I get moved back to preliminary, and finally we just decided to litigate. It took about 4 or 5 years and over $40,000 in just legal fees, let alone engineering and consulting fees, as we went through a myriad of issues. And we ended up entering into a stipulated court ordered agreement between the town and my company that I managed, that only allowed me to build 12 lots. If I knew I was going to end at 12, I probably would have done a 9-lot subdivision, built the road in, did the first 8, retained the remaining lands, waited for the 5 years to run out, and then done another 3 or 4 lot subdivision later. And totally avoided Act 250. That's a common process that small developers will use. We'll do a 9-lot subdivision with 8 residential lots. We'll retain the land. We'll wait for the 5 years to run out. We'll do another 8 lots, and you'll see projects get built that way.
Which we changed in S100.
Right.
It's no longer an issue.
Well, in designated areas.
Yes.
In designated
exactly.
areas.
Like this would be.
I work in rural Vermont primarily.
Okay, the Highgate example was it.
So just up the road on the same street, right? You know, there were some leadership changes in Highgate after we got that 12-unit project built and online. There was an opportunity to buy an 11-acre parcel. Our soil test pits found that probably the first 20 feet of soil would have been sieve tested as mound sand. So that could have supported decentralized sewer without bringing in any extra fill or anything. I could have done, rough estimate was 40 units if I went with a multifamily project. I could have done as many as 20 single family, but again, 1 acre per home. So I do the cost benefit on 11 versus 9, and I find in the end that for the extra 2 lots, after my Act 250 expense, I would have only made a combined 15,000 if everything went through perfectly. If I had any delays, that 15,000 goes to 0 very quick and can go backwards. So there are 9 houses there where there should be 20, where there could have been a huge multifamily project for that area that provided a low barrier entry form of housing to people in a community that desperately need it.
15,000 per unit?
No, just between $7,500 per unit if everything went through perfectly. And that's taking the extra cost with Act 250 and the consulting and the engineering fees and weighing it against an average profit margin for an additional 2 lots. And I determined that, you know, the potential profit on the last 2 lots, if everything went through perfectly, was only $15,000 more after deducting the cost of Act 250.
Because you're not renting them, you're.
I'm selling them. So I work with folks, and I picked 3 that I'm actively working with now to illustrate today. I work with folks that are usually shut out from the housing market one way or the other. But I'm working with a couple right now who looked for a home for 18 months on the open market. Lost bidding war after bidding war, you know, they're a young couple with 2 kids. They have good paying jobs, but not 6-figure each, so they're not in a position to go buy a $500,000 home. They worked with a grandparent in Enosburg that owned 55 acres. The grandparent did a simple 2-lot subdivision. Carved them off 2 acres, they're gonna put a new manufactured home on it, they're using the equity, all they're paying for the land is the grandfather's cost. In developing the property and getting it ready to have this subdivided lot for them, so they're gonna be able to purchase that. I'm working with a couple that's moving from Fort Lauderdale to Fairfield on a lot that they recently purchased that was recently subdivided in the last 3 years. I'm working with another couple that owns a multi-level home in Enosburg that wants to sell it because they are at retirement age. They're in their early 70s. This rampant inflation has drastically increased their housing costs, among other costs. So in their mind, they're going to have to sell their home that they quite honestly wanted to live to the end of their life in, as long as they could. They're gonna sell that, recoup some equity, and then pay to buy a recently subdivided 3-acre lot. Put in a new manufactured home, 1 level. They'll have extra equity to put in the bank to help supplement the rising costs that they're facing, and their housing costs will be lower. Because manufactured homes, like again, I could highlight the benefit of a manufactured home for hours, but we build them quickly. We build them in a sustainable model. We upgrade insulation values, we do high efficiency natural gas or propane furnaces. We now are coming out with technology around heat pump integration. So that natural gas will only have to be used if the heat pump hits a certain temperature that makes it inefficient. We are moving in a carbon neutral model as fast as we can, and there's, you know, this industry is moving in that direction nationally. Again, I could come. All right, and again, I come and talk about manufactured homes all day. But so we were talking about conduit earlier, 10-foot sticks that you have to glue together. Now, when I was doing those 2 projects I talked to you about, and we did those power services, a 3-inch, 10-foot piece of conduit was around $11, $12, $15 at most. That same item hit over $80 at the peak of COVID inflation and then settled back in the $60 range. A $25,000 power service to service 8 homes is over 60, 70, 80,000 today. I mean, these road construction is doubled. So I switched focus. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. The legislature came out with S100. So I wanted to build my first multifamily project and start renting. Because I see people every day that are disadvantaged, that just need access to housing that can't afford to buy. So I decided to take the capital that I would normally invest in a residential subdivision and instead invest it in the spirit of S100 in an area that was a state designated growth center with water and sewer. So I went through all of Franklin County zoning maps. I found a growth center illuminated on St. Albans Town's zoning map. So it just said growth center. I spoke with the zoning office. I found a landowner. I spent 6 weeks getting under contract. I lined up financing. I lined up a design team to get permits rolling as quickly as we could. Only to get a jurisdictional opinion that the growth center that I thought I was in is not state recognized. It's near St. Albans City's downtown, but the fact that that downtown is in St. Albans City and not St. Albans Town prohibits the town from being able to use it to get its state recognition. So they just created a zoning district and called it a growth center. I mean, St. Albans Town, but also give them credit. They are one of the communities that are fully following the spirit of your legislation last year in S100. We actually expanded on it in my role as a select board member. We modernized our bylaws with our RPC. And we made it a permitted use with no DRB review whatsoever to be able to get a building permit anywhere we allow a single family home in our town for up to 4 units. Whether or not you have access to municipal water and sewer, because if you can get a DEC permit to build a on-site septic system and to have on-site potable water for up to 4 units, you should be able to build it whether or not you're paying into a city system or you're building infrastructure on your own land. That's our mindset. So those 3 people that I told you about, the young couple in Enosburg, the couple in Berkshire, and the couple in Fairfield. All three of those lots would have fallen into Act 250 jurisdiction and would not have been subdivided under the language that was passed in the House. That is that's the deeply concerning part for me, as someone who sees people that are in housing transitions, that purchase land in rural Vermont, that build just one home. Those options, those opportunities are gonna become more limited because you're often dealing with people who aren't developers, that don't understand Act 250, that need to make the decision to do these small scale subdivisions in order for those opportunities to exist. And you're gonna notice that the subdivision of lots in rural Vermont, which I think is an intended goal, will go down. That said, the legislative intent behind that language, I think, is to preserve forest land and to limit impacts to ecologically sensitive areas. And I support that 100%. I think we can do that through density. Instead of, expand exemptions, and I know that there are concerns around exemptions. But expand them to areas that are beyond just a state recognized growth center. So that a town like St. Albans Town that is adjacent to a downtown and meets all the other criteria can work with you to say, okay, these are the minimum set of zoning bylaws for density and what have you, that we're willing to accept in a zoning district that will give an Act 250 exemption. Let us adopt it as an interim set of bylaws and get that exemption so that we can start building the housing in our communities. Also, I would very seriously take a look at treating on-site water and sewer the same as municipal water and sewer in certain areas. And I think that's gonna be a difficult conversation to determine exactly how you go about doing it. But there are very specific examples I can give you of where I could support a multifamily project of 40 to 50 units and not have to hook into a municipal sewer system to do it, and I couldn't figure out a way to do on-site water.
I think we have that in the village center designation.
Right, so if we could expand those exemptions to areas that make sense beyond village centers and state recognized growth centers. Because again, we're in a housing crisis. Maybe when you extend the 25 lot exemption to. Maybe if you could extend that 5 years, but come up with a 2-year exemption, similar to how you came up with a 24 lot exemption. For other areas that are outside of the two that you predominantly chosen to exempt, just as a means of getting housing online as quickly as possible. I think that'd be really beneficial.
I have the designated area plus half a mile, for instance.
Right,
Would
but
that solve your situation?
yeah, it wouldn't, I'm over half a mile away from the city's growth center or the village district, or the downtown district. I see so many people that are left on the bench that have the ability to attain housing, but the supply isn't there. So I think from a land use perspective, our regulatory regime and our housing market was predicated on losing a small percentage of our population every year. Now we're going the other way. We just need to do a quick course correct to get more housing online, to eliminate the backlog that we're experiencing that's driving up prices. And then we also need to look at how we're going to modernize Act 250 into the future. I think there are certain elements of what the attorney from DRM just testified about that. I couldn't find myself shaking my head just up and down any harder during anyone else's testimony. Hit the nail on the head. But we really need to use our status as a Dillon's Rule state also to make sure that municipalities can't arbitrarily say, okay, you have soils that would support a certain density. You're in a residential area that's a pretty developed, but we're gonna limit you at 1 acre per unit. I think there needs to be a statewide standard that says if you're in a certain area, maybe not up on the hill by the creek, but if you're in a developed area and you have a certain set of soils, we need to maximize density, because if we don't, and we continue to see projects that could support 25,000 units on 11 acres and we get 9, that's going to push those people that still need housing into the ecologically sensitive areas, and it'll further fragment our forests. So,
Sweet, and one question center right to you.
Oh, thank you, and it's Deso, is that?
Deso.
Deso.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Deso, for coming and presenting to us today, and for your public service on your select board. And for the work that you're doing around manufactured homes. We have Vermont in our district,
Yeah.
which if you're familiar with is I'm a pretty big fan of them. So I appreciate the work you're doing. So I was trying to track as you were talking, kind of all the different points you were making. And the 3 examples that you were given. My confusion is it seems like all 3 of them did happen.
so
So I don't
that
understand what
24,
the issue is.
I'm under contract to purchase about over an acre and a quarter. And that growth center, that's not a growth center. And I have a purchase and sale agreement with the landowner that gives me the right to terminate if an Act 250 permit is required.
Okay,
I got a JO in the last week or so that said, for 2 reasons, Act 250 required. Thank you for this question.
yeah,
I'm not in the state recognized growth center, I'm not in a village district. So, right off the bat, I'm over 10 unit, I'm 10 or more, Act 250. So I have to. If there's a way that this could be covered, because at the time I thought, well, maybe we just need to get the state to recognize this area as a growth center, maybe it's just the box that town hasn't checked.
yeah,
Turned out to be it's not possible because the downtown's not in the same locality. He said, well, this whole subdivision that you're purchasing a lot in was an Act 250 subdivision when it was done 15, 20 years ago. And for that reason alone, you're an Act 250. So there should, in my opinion, be language that says, if you're buying land that's in a previous Act 250 project and you're using it for an exempt use, that should stop the buck with Act 250 right there. It creates a second bite at the apple to require a permit.
and your reason for avoiding Act 250 is because you have done a cost benefit analysis and you will not make enough profit to warrant going through.
My primary reason for this 24 unit housing project, which will be rentals, not sold units.
Yeah.
Condos, not manufactured homes, so it should be 2-bedroom, 1-bath rentals for workforce housing, that's the idea. We actually want to approach our local hospital, Beta Technologies, and a couple other employers about, maybe working in some master leases to help them attract qualified employees to the area, because we hear over and over again that employers can't find employees because of housing. So
Okay,
to
the question-
get back to Act 250, it's going to add about $125,000 and about 6 months if everything goes perfectly.
And you don't believe that,
I think it puts me on the cut line on whether or not it's worth it to me to invest that kind of a capital outlay, not knowing if I'm gonna receive the permit I need for the number of units I need to make the project pencil out and end. If I go through Act 250 and we hit a few criterion, or we have pushback from neighbors, NIMBYism is a huge thing throughout Vermont, especially rural Vermont. You'll find that maybe instead of 24, I only get 16, and I've got all this capital tied up predicated on 24. If I only get 16, I can't build the project because I can't afford to lose money every month to only build 16,
yeah,
and then that money is just eviscerated. So that's the perspective of a small
Yeah.
person, we can't
so
continue to pay.
the profit wouldn't be there to.
Well, that, and if we go through Act 250 and the unit count is reduced, like I've seen it in the past.
Yeah, you'll make less money,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
so-
I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
understand, you're a business, I get it, that's not a bad thing.
And I would share that on an 8-unit property. At today's interest rates, with today's exorbitantly high rental rate, I'm predicating this on $1,800 a month.
Yeah,
I
easily,
mean,
yeah.
I'm penciling to make on an 8-unit building less than $3,000 a month if everything's rented and goes perfectly. So if I have a vacant unit and an eviction, I'm in the red every month. These are the considerations that we give. I mean, I'm not a staunch opponent of Act 250. I think it does have value in a lot of cases. But given where we are today and the price of housing, especially for lower income Vermonters, being where it is, we have to take extraordinary measures at a statewide level, and quickly.
Can I just ask a quick question? Okay, if you wanted to start a project, so all your projects, as all the developers have described to us, take years. We're talking like minimum 3 years to do. So when you're talking about the crisis we're experiencing and a quick response, what is the timeline for you typically with a project from start to finish?
If I'm not going through Act 250, I plan for a year. If I'm going through
Year.
yeah, if I'm going through Act 250, I plan for 18 to 24 months. And that's if everything goes perfectly.
That's not crazy. That
So,
seems.
but here's the problem. We have a lot of regulatory programs throughout the state that have value and need to exist, but that are inherently slow. I have a stormwater permit that was deemed an administratively complete application on or around December 10th that hasn't been reviewed yet. And we're sitting here on April 3rd. This pervades all levels of state bureaucracy, and it's not saying that the half acre rule does not have ecological value. I have at my mini storage facility, I'm building a second gravel wetland as part of an expansion. I don't complain about having to build it. I watch the ecological benefit happen every day. It makes sense, but it shouldn't take 4 to 5 months to even have a reviewer look at the permit and tell me if I need to make any adjustments, because I can't file a final Mylar with the town and satisfy my DRB permit for that site plan amendment that I just went through and easily went through town government. Because I don't know if the reviewer at DEC in the stormwater program might have an adjustment that needs to be made that could change the site plan. So it holds me up from building, this is a commercial property, I'm paying predominantly into the hedge fund. It's costing the state tax dollars. And it's, costing me a rentable storage facility that would fill up within 6 months.
So you've got the quickest turnaround on projects we've heard so far.
Well, I stay small and I do a lot of the pre-development work myself as a small person. That 9-lot project I went through with a Photoshop sketch of how I wanted it to look with the easements drawn in and handed it to an engineer. And that first, my professional engineer put it through AutoCAD, made some adjustments, and that's what we went to the DRB with. That saves me 2 to 3 months. Every project, just being able to do that work myself, that's why I stay small. I do 6 to 10 homes a year. I don't wanna take on any more than that. Because when you do, you have to take on employees, you
Yes.
owe them a fair living, you owe them benefits that they can live on and provide for their families. And you have to do that much more work to be able to keep up with it, you have to get bigger, and when you get bigger, there's more risk. And I'm risk adverse at my age, I'm gonna be 27 tomorrow. I just don't want to start.
I did wanna ask what your age was, I was like.
I just don't wanna start my life with this business that I purchased from grandparents that took 20 years to build up to what it is. I've expanded it, I've doubled our storage unit facility. I've done quite a few developments myself without any oversight, including Act 250 projects. I don't wanna go too far over the line and have an Act 250 permit not come in. And then I lose my capital that I had access to. Now, if I wanna do another project, I'm borrowing against the equity in my commercial property. It's a slippery slope and it all leads to bankruptcy as a small developer. If you're not extraordinarily careful. I know I was all over the board, so to get back and be succinct with my recommendations. I would look at how to expand exemptions in areas that have existing soils where the municipality adopts a minimum density standard. I would look to expand the exemption to areas beyond villages, downtowns, and state recognized growth centers to any zoning district that met a short list of succinct bylaw density requirements. And I would look at the language in 687. I think we'll have a lot of adverse consequences for rural Vermont. I'm sure you'll hear a lot about that as you consider that bill and its language. I would say if you support the language to the point where you don't want to see it die, put it to a study committee and really meter out, the bill calls for regional planning commissions to make the determination as to what are ecologically sensitive areas.
Tier 3, yeah.
So, tier 3. There are too many unknowns. Do RPCs all have folks on staff? Are they hiring consultants? Is that funding available? Will that take 3 years? Could it take long for some rural communities to identify their tier 3? Could the language go into effect as statute before tier 3 areas are all mapped and ready to go? I don't know the answer to those questions. What will it do to Vermont's rural housing starts? Will it drastically decline to a state that it'll contribute to the housing crisis further? Or will it not have that big of an impact? I don't know. But I do know that when we do things like move from 1 acre of impervious for a stormwater discharge permit to half acre without adding appropriate staff which is hard enough to get a staff member, even when you have an opening that's fully funded, let alone expand a team. You just have to expect that a 3-month permit becomes a 6-month permit because there are twice as many coming through the door, and I think you'll find that with Act 250. Without doing a proper analysis on, do we need more district coordinators? Do we need to shrink districts and create more districts to be able to hear all these permits, to be able to issue them quickly enough so that they don't die on the vine? Should certain small scale projects, 3 lots or less, even in a tier 3 area, should they have a fee waiver? If they're being put to use in a certain way, for workforce, single family housing. There are just a lot of unknowns, but I think just in the testimony that I've heard today from the attorney that came before me, if you modernize how Act 250 permits are processed. And you made it very clear to developers, if you meet these specific set of requirements, you have a complete application. We'll ask for supplemental documents before your hearing to present them then, and within so many days, you can expect to have a permit. And then you reinforce staffing at the environmental court level to hear appeals, and you tighten up the timeline there. That's really all you can do. Because no one should be here advocating for a full elimination of Act 250.
Yes.
We just need to expand a few exemptions on a temporary basis, see how they work, maybe make them permanent in the future, and then modernize how the applications and appeals are heard. And if we're able to do that, I think you'll see a lot of small people like me taking on 20, 40 unit, or if you move to 50 in certain areas, 49 unit projects. That will be online within the next 1 to 3 years. And that'll go a long way towards lowering the cost of rental units and making sure that, working Vermonters with families aren't couch surfing while they're trying to find a place to live. And you see people all the time, they live in a small apartment building that was sold, no cause eviction so that the new owner can move into their unit, and then where do they go? They might put out 30 applications across 3 counties and not get a phone call back. I mean, these people are in crisis.
Can I ask you a quick question on DEC permitting? So have you had to have wetlands determination?
So every property, when I look at a project, the first thing I look at are wetland impacts. If there are wetlands present on the property, can I impact just a buffer area in a way that's permissible to get a general permit from the wetlands program? A lot of time it really factors the timeline, like I went under contract on that 1.25 acre parcel in January, knowing full well that I had an advisory layer in the state's GIS wetland mapping system present. Knowing that I wouldn't be able to get a state accepted delineation until mid-May when the vegetation had fully returned. That's a rule at the wetland program level. They don't look at dead vegetation at all. Again, I'm not here in Senate Natural Resources advocating to fill in wetlands and Cape Paradise. I'm politically aware enough to know that that's not the right move in this room, nor do I advocate for it, But if you can permit me to impact a wetland buffer, and I'm able to pay my mitigation fees, and we're able to put housing online, that makes a lot of sense. Also, it's not really worth talking about wetlands right now because, a lot of Supreme Court decisions are gonna have to be made around what is a water of the United States that triggered Army Corps mitigation fees. The state's impact fees are not too bad. Army Corps is $200,000 per acre, class 1, 2, or 3. The state doesn't even take jurisdiction or make you get a permit for a class 3 wetland. The Army Corps will charge you $200,000 an acre. That property that I'm looking at that has a pocket of wetlands present on it, potential, I don't think it's a wetland, but I don't know. That is somehow hydraulically connected to a small spring, a small stream that goes to a brook that goes to the lake. So I'm gonna have to work with Michael Adams and the Army Corps of Engineers office and have to pay that hefty impact fee, and that's worked into my pre-development cost. But again, we deal with a ton of issues throughout the regulatory process, but as far as Act 250 is concerned, if you can tighten it up, if you can make permits come out faster and make appeals get heard faster, I think you'll be doing a great service to the state. And then my last suggestion, you have communities like mine that have fully went with the spirit of S100, even in ways that we weren't asked to. And if you can get a permit for an 8-bedroom mound system through DEC and you wanna build a 4-unit building with 2 bedrooms per unit, I don't care if you have access to municipal water and sewer, build it, we need the housing stuff. Then you have other urban communities that have municipal water and sewer and have brokered that have enacted interim bylaws around lot coverage percentages, parking, you name it, and they're evading your legislative intent. That needs to be codified, those communities need to be held to account. Now, Mr. Brady has the most difficult job in the state, trying to balance communities like mine and communities that don't want a particular issue to see the light of day. I just hope that when you wrap this language up and you combine 311 and 687, and it goes, whatever happens with that, that the legislative intent behind small scale rentals in areas with water and sewer especially, if not, anywhere you permit a single family home that has the ability to have an on-site septic system and drilled well, should be treated the same, in my opinion. You'll see housing stock get built in place, but codify your intent. You make it so that they can't evade you. We are a Dillon's Rule state for this reason. And there's nothing more aggravating than having a sweeping law that took so much political capital to get through the building, come into effect. And it must be so frustrating from your seats to see communities figure out little ways to try to evade your intent. I have small scale developers that meet the prescriptive requirements of S100 to build 4-unit properties or to expand from a 3 to a 4-unit that have permit denials. Because of a parking, I've had someone come to me and say, I want to expand from a 2 to a 4-unit without adding an inch of impervious under S100's 1.5 parking spots per unit calculation. And the municipality requires 2 currently. I don't have enough land to build 2 per unit. It'll put me over their also really restrictive lot coverage bylaw. And the reply I get from the zoning office when I go in and I talk about that is the 1.5 spots per unit doesn't come into effect until December, so don't apply until then. I mean, communities are doing everything they can to evade your intent, and people are in crisis. I wish you a ton of luck in metering this out and, meeting the moment for Vermont's working families and lower income folks who just need a place to call home.
We are gonna stop there.
Thank you.
We are 8 minutes over. Thanks for all your information. Anyone who wants to hang around and talk, please do. I'm sorry, Tim McCormick, I know you had a question.
A request,
But-
but I will also.
Okay, so Mr. Viso, thanks for a frontline report. It's always helpful to hear from someone. Thanks for the work you're doing. Thanks for helping the committee. One more.
Best of luck. I know it's really hard to make this all balance at the end of the day when you're trying to preserve, a land use regulation that has had a positive impact for our state for over 50 years. You're trying to modify it for a changing housing market. It's very tough. But thank you for the work you're doing.